Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of chats with leading scholars in the field. With me today is Sarah Bush of Temple University, who has just published a new book, The Taming of Democracy Assistance. Sarah, welcome to GW.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about this book and kind of what you were trying to accomplish and what you think you found.
Absolutely. So I got interested in the topic of the book, which is democracy assistance, when I was a graduate student at Princeton University. And when I was there, I had the opportunity to participate with other students who were working on public policy in writing a report for the UN Electoral Assistance Division and the U.S. Agency for International Development and also the State Department about managing elections in fragile states. And in the course of working on this report, I traveled not to the Middle East actually, which is my favorite place to travel, but to Rwanda, and studied what the international community was doing to support the democratization process that they hoped was going on there at the time. Doesn't seem to have worked out so well. And I was so interested when I went there and saw what it was that was being supported under the rubric of promoting democracy. And one kind of image that stuck with me a lot after going on this trip was going to this big, fancy, new electoral commission that had been built in Rwanda with a lot of support from the international community. And going there and seeing the state-of-the-art ballots, the many desks with brand new computers, all of the technology of democracy that was being put in place to hold a clean, fair election in Rwanda. And basically nobody was there, even though it was a regular workday. And I became fascinated with how did the international community choose to focus on the technical aspects of elections that they did in Rwanda, and there was a huge emphasis on supporting women's political participation. Why did that come about? And then I went to the Middle East. I went to Jordan to do some language work and some additional research. And I saw that kind of echoes of the types of programs that I observed in Rwanda. I saw, again, a big emphasis on supporting women's groups, supporting women's political participation, a lot of very technical assistance programs. And I wondered, again, why is this so much of what the international community is supporting as part of democracy promotion? And so what I'm trying to do in the book is to understand this and basically come up with an explanation for how it is that the United States, Western European countries, and international institutions promote democracy in the ways that they do.
So one way of saying it might be there's lots of democracy promotion, very little democracy. Everyone seems fine with that.
Yeah. So how did we get to that state of affairs? And one of the things that I try to show in the book is that it wasn't always the case that democracy assistance focused so much on technical activities. In the 1980s when it began, democracy assistance did a lot more to support dissident groups and political parties and trade unions. And my explanation is that that change has something to do with changing trends in the countries that are the targets of democracy assistance. These countries have gotten better at trying to keep democracy assistance out, but it also has to do with the professionalization of the organizations that are involved in democracy assistance, which I think is a sort of underappreciated part of the story of this taming of democracy assistance that's in the book's title. And that's what I put a lot of emphasis on in the book, is tracing out how these organizations in the field of democracy promotion, how they professionalize and why sometimes they aid democracy in ways that, at least to the outside observers, seem surprising. And we wonder, will this actually lead to democratization?
And so you look a lot at the organizations themselves, and because they have all of those incentives that are very different from what democracy advocates might like. They need to survive as organizations, they need to maintain working relations with host regimes. They need to keep getting money from the State Department and US aid. So how do you see them navigating those things? You talked about professionalization, technical assistance. Give us some examples of things that you observed that they were doing within this domain.
Absolutely. So one person who used to work in the democracy industry called this phenomenon the democracy dance, so delicately trying to interact in ways that hopefully promote democracy but also keep the organizations running. And an example that comes to mind, or I can give a couple maybe of examples that really stuck out to me during the time that I was doing field research in Jordan, which is one of the cases I study in the book. So one example would be aid to support the Jordanian parliament. Now, support for parliaments around the world has become a really important component of democracy assistance, although it wasn't always that way. And in Jordan, during the period of my field research, the parliament was actually dismissed by the king. And so there were no longer members of parliament. Elections were going to be at some unknown time in the future, but there was a major initiative that was being funded by the US government in Jordan to support the parliament and to make sure that it had an electronic voting machine, to make sure that it had a great press office, to make sure that the staffs who were working at the parliament were professional and could go about their business well. And so to me, this is an example of a kind of program where if you know something about Jordan, which I know you do know quite a bit, you know that one of the ways that the government stays in power is that it uses the parliament to give out patronage to some of its supporters, and also perhaps as kind of a good PR move to look a little bit democratic. And so to my mind, this kind of endeavor that is being supported by some of the organizations in this field that I called the democracy establishment in Jordan, that was helping the parliament professionalize, make sure that it had a good PR strategy, make sure that there was an electronic voting machine, but there was no parliament, nobody to actually vote. So this is the kind of dynamic that I was interested in.
One theme that runs through multiple chapters in the book is you talk about the focus on women's rights and strengthening women's participation. And it's a delicate issue, right? Because on the one hand, these are important issues on their own. On the other hand, you argue that there's only a tangential relationship between that and democracy. It's an interesting issue that I know people have talked about a lot. And maybe you could say a little bit about that, how you see the relationship between this enormous amount of attention on promoting women's participation and rights and the democracy industry, as you're calling it.
Yes, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So I think that supporting women's rights and women's political participation is a really good and important thing to do. But one of the things that I try to distinguish in the book is between things that might be good for various reasons and then things that we have good reason to think really push democratization. And I'm not sure that supporting women's political participation is such a thing. It might be, but I think the jury is still out. And so in countries like Jordan, but actually many countries in the Middle East, in Africa, in Central Asia and beyond, have been taking great steps to try to increase the number of women in their parliament, even as they don't actually democratize in any other ways. And some people, including some people who have worked on these programs, a scholar named Melinda Herring comes to mind, have argued that actually by giving the regimes some good sort of liberal window dressing, if you will, by having more women in parliament, that can even help authoritarian regimes stay in power. So I think that it might be a really good thing, and it could have important long-term effects to have women's numbers increase in parliaments around the world. But if the parliaments are fundamentally not democratic institutions and not are in authoritarian states, then I think that it is not, we don't know yet that we can really say that getting more women in such parliament will help democratization.
Now, since the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings, the environment for these democracy organizations has really tightly constricted. The government seem to see them as a threat,
right,
even though you see them as largely tame. How do you explain that disconnect?
So I think that the phenomenon that I tried to show in the book of the organizations professionalizing, even if this is a general trend that is happening in the field, it still can sometimes be the case that organizations will be out there that will be taking a really strong activist approach to promoting democracy. And so even if this is a general trend, we have less organizations aiding dissidents than we did 25 years ago, let's say, we still have some organizations that are trying to do that, and that is, I think, can be very threatening to governments. And I think that governments in the Middle East, as well as elsewhere, saw what happened in the colored revolutions and got really scared. I would also note, however, that sometimes clamping down on organizations that are involved in democracy promotion can serve other purposes, like being a good PR move for governments that may have populations that are skeptical of having foreign NGOs in their countries messing around in the political process, just like we are here sometimes in the United States too.
Well, so one of the things which is interesting about the book, and I think this is very much in line with kind of trends within the political science discipline, is that you do a very nice job of doing kind of a large cross-national study and then drilling down on cases within the Middle East. And I think that the interplay between those is very well done. When you do that, do you see anything about the Middle East that looks different? Are there things about these Middle Eastern cases that don't seem to be in line with what you saw globally?
There are. So the Middle East is the region in the world where democracy assistance tends to be tamest, according to my phrase. And I think that has to do with the fact that this is the region where the United States, the largest funder of democracy assistance programs, really has a lot of interests that sometimes the government, at least the United States, think run counter to promoting democracy. And so I don't want to make the claim that the organizations and the industry make all of the decisions. The donor governments make a lot of the decisions too, and the US government's interest in maintaining stability sometimes in countries like Jordan, rather than seeing democratization, which might bring to power some political forces that could be counter to interests of the United States and the region, or in Jordan specifically. This is an encouragement to have more of these tamer approaches to democracy assistance than you might see in sub-Saharan Africa, let's say, where there are fewer competing interests.
So if you look at this, you look at the amount of money that's been spent on this, I mean, is your conclusion that everyone would be better off if these organizations and these programs were just shut down, or would you adapt them to do different types of things in terms of advancing U.S. interests or advancing the interests of democracy or the interests of people living in those countries? I mean, what follows at the end of the day from your analysis?
I think that the recommendation is that if you're funding these programs, let's say, and you don't want for them to be taking this kind of tame approach, so maybe not in a country like Jordan, let's say, where of course government officials on the donor side of things do have incentives to support a tame approach. But if you want the programs to be less tame, then I think there are ways to promote better competition within the field of democracy assistance between organizations to make sure that the organizations that are going to be most effective rise to the top and get more funding, and the organizations that are more likely to pull the programs away from donors' preferences and towards the organization's preferences for their own survival. I think trying to set up the right kind of competition is a way to foster that. But there's other ideas too about trying to set up the right kinds of accountability or monitoring and observation that doesn't emphasize bad indicators or insufficient indicators, let's say, like just what is the number of women in parliament, but more fine-grained, nuanced indicators sometimes, and better micro-level impact evaluations.
Well, great. Thank you. Sarah Bush, Temple University, new book, Taming Democracy Assistance. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.